Welcome to Raging Bullets, episode 409, Pop Culture and Whatnot, with Freddie E. Williams II and Jim Mitchell on Savage Sword of Conan. Welcome to Raging Bullets. I'm Sean Whalen, drnorge, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Jim, the sensei of the Whatnot Segulin and the Duke of You Know.
How's it going, eh?
On this episode, we're going to be joined by longtime friend of the show, Freddie E. Williams II, and Jim Mitchell as we discuss Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword, issue number 9 from Dark Horse. They did a short story in there about Conan, and it's really cool because these are two friends who have done a story that I'm very fond of called Chance of a Lifetime, and it was a chance for them to get together and do a Conan story for Dark Horse. And I love hearing a writer and artist talk about the process on getting the story pitched, getting it eventually into our hands as readers. We are proud members of the Comics Podcast Networks, the League of Comic Book Podcasts, and the DCinfinite.com podcast partnership. Sponsoring this episode is DCBService.com and InStockTrades.com. Over at DCBService.com, they are your comic book pre-order source. And I love the bundles. I also love the statues. Jim, do you find yourself buying, I know you and I have different buying habits. Do you buy things outside of traditional comics when you shop from DCBService.com? Like, I find myself collecting certain statues now. Do you buy, like, action figures, statues, or any other swag ever? Or how does that work for you?
I've been getting some statues, but I've also been doing more bundles.
Okay.
Especially the variant cover bundles, and I'm finding I'm getting more variant covers and stuff like that. Stuff I didn't used to get, but you get a bundle of, say, like the Lego bundle or the Darren Cook bundle they're doing right now. You know, I'm like, okay, let me get that. So I got all those variant covers. So I think that's kind of more where I'm going, but I have been looking at some statues.
Well, let me ask you that. With the variants, the Darwin Cook variant bundle, I'm looking at it right now that you're talking about. Do you find that, like, when you want a certain variant line, that you want all of them? Is it a collector's thing for you? Like, you want to have all of them, you know, kind of got to have them all?
Yeah, that's, you know, especially with when they started doing some of these bundles, you know, initially I wasn't doing that. I was like, this is my favorite title. I'll get a variant here. I'll get a variant here. But now when they put it all nice together, it's just an easy click for me. And there's a couple, you know, titles in there that I'm like, it's not like my favorite title. So normally I wouldn't, but it's easier, and, you know, you do save a little bit more money if you're getting them all together instead of just saying all but one.
Well, it's 23 titles in that lineup, too, of all Darwin Cook variant covers. And I'm a huge fan of New Frontier, so they have me at Darwin Cook just because I love the artwork. So that's neat. Now, I'm with you. I do think that I would lean to that. Over at InStockTrades.com, Jim, Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword number 9, which we're going to be talking about on this episode, is available right now. It's regularly $7.99. It's 42% off, only $4.63. This is an 80-page book. We're going to be talking about the Conan short story that Jim and Freddie worked on this episode, but you can pick up and get the whole 80-page volume for $4.63. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer for me, and it's InStockTrades.com is always running wonderful specials, so be sure to shop on through there. They do have trade paperbacks of previous issues of Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword, as well as individual issues. So if you're a Conan fan or a fan of the whole Robert E. Howard verse and you want to bundle them all together to save money on that shipping, consider doing that over at InStockTrades.com. James, what kind of a podcast are we?
Pop Culture and Whatnot, a division of Raging Bullets, is a spoiler podcast. We go in-depth into plotline, story twists, and whatnot associated with Dark Horse's Savage Sword of Conan. So, if you haven't read the book, what are you waiting for? Go over, pick it up, read it, enjoy it, come back, listen to us. That way, we can all enjoy the show.
I like that you task them with enjoying it. You enjoy it! And don't you come back until you do! That was a new twist on it for you.
Yes.
Sensei's all business this episode. Without further ado, let's talk Conan.
Nice work, Atom. What are these characters up to?
Joining us in this very special episode is friend of the show, Freddie E. Williams II, and new friend of the show, Jim Mitchell. And guys, welcome to Raging Bullets.
Thanks for having us on. Hi, thank you. Good to be here.
We're going to be discussing the upcoming story that they're going to have in Savage Sword. It's actually Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword, issue number 9. It's a Conan story. And actually, before we talk about the actual story, I'd love to talk to you guys about your history together, because I know you both from Chance of a Lifetime. So can you tell us a little bit about how you guys got to know each other, what the background is?
I want to say it was maybe like 2004 or so. I was just like searching for some artists, and I ended up seeing Freddie's work. It's either on like digital webbing or Pencil Jack, one of those, or maybe I saw it both. And it's kind of, I really liked his work. It was the Martian Manhunter pages that you did. And so I just emailed him out of the blue asking, hey, would you have any interest in working on a short story? And that short story ended up being the original short story version of Chance of a Lifetime, which was 8 pages. And ever since then, we had, I think, probably 2 other like small projects that we did too. And then, we worked on a lot of things behind the scenes, like a lot of pitches that never actually saw the light of day. But yeah, I mean, basically ever since 2004, I feel like we've had a really good relationship and always got along good and worked good together, and it's always been fun.
Yeah, I agree. I will add to that at the time I was the Martian Manhunter and Wonder Man pages that I drew. On a side note, I just got, like not too long ago, was at the Arizona convention, and somebody brought one of those pages by. I had sold one of the pages, and then whoever I sold it to sold it to someone else, and they brought it by me at the convention and was like, what book was this from? Like they were looking for it as if it was a real issue that had been published somewhere. Anyway, just that it was, just a recent event. But I had been working on some portfolio pages, and digital webbing and Pencil Jack are both places that are good that I would recommend even now for artists that are trying to break in professionally, because you can post your artwork and get critiques and stuff, and then also you can potentially hook up with, cool writers. And I think the biggest success story for this sort of thing that I'm talking about would be with Ryan Otley posting on Pencil Jack and digital webbing, and Robert Kirkman finding him there whenever they were looking to replace Corey Walker on Invincible. It was just Ryan Otley's work really stood out. He's an excellent artist, and then that's how they connected. But I had been getting a lot of, on Pencil Jack and digital webbing, getting a lot of people asking questions. Like, people would send me direct messages asking if I was willing to either work for free or work for very little money on developing pitches or trying to do a creator-owned thing. And when you get a lot of messages that are like that, you have to be, I don't know, I guess really frugal with what you agree to, because it's not like you have all the time in the world. It's like these projects take up a lot of time. And so if I remember correctly, I think when Jim had messaged me, he did not include all the details for Chance of a Lifetime, and that's a good thing because you don't want to give away your ideas and stuff. He didn't include that in the initial conversation, and when I first got it, I was just thinking, oh, this is another one of those proposals where I'm going to have to slave away for a month for zero money on a project I'm maybe not that interested in. Like, that was my first thought. But I asked Jim what the story was about, and he sent me a brief synopsis of Chance of a Lifetime, and I immediately loved and still love Jim's writing style, the emotional core to Chance of a Lifetime story, and then the subject matter, because it has some sort of retro, the time period, the genre and stuff is all, it's in between World War I and World War II, so I enjoy drawing period piece sort of stuff. Anyway, I think that we clicked really well on that level, and after we did the initial short story, a friendship grew from that, and because of that, he's one of my oldest friends now, because it's been about 10 years or a little, somewhere around in there, and there's not a lot of, I've worked with a lot of writers, since Jim, and in addition to Jim, but there's few writers that I get along with as well, and can be as collaborative and honest and open and that sort of thing. So it's really cool to be on Raging Bullet show, the podcast together and stuff.
One of the reasons why I wanted to start with your history together is because I reread Chance of a Lifetime prior to this, just because I wanted to kind of get back into my own sense of, because we met you, Freddie, from when your work on Robin, and as is typical when when there's an artist that I start to get attached to, I want to see some of their previous work, and that led me to Chance of a Lifetime. And at the time, I had downloaded, it was an iPhone app through iVerse, and that was the first time I had really bought a comic that way. It was, digital was in its infancy, as far as comics being released digitally, but it was a cool way to be able to just read that story as a geeky fan who liked a new story. But you guys, you mentioned the emotional core of the relationship that you guys have as a writer and artist, and I think that story really showcases that, and I think this Conan story we're going to be talking about also showcases that, because in Chance of a Lifetime, you've got a person who is very real, in the sense he's looking back at, he had powers, and all of a sudden those powers were stripped away because of life choices. And there's regret that's there, not just from the time when he has powers, but also from his life beforehand. And trying to find that balance that I think we all struggle with, of what are those positive moments in your life that drive you and motivate you and make you go, wow, this was all worth it? And what are those moments that bring you down? I think we all kind of struggle to find that balance to make our life move forward in a positive fashion. Chance of a Lifetime was so cool because basically, you had a Superman archetype, but he was one of us. He was very real with our frailties and our faults emotionally. And to be able to see his life and the mess of things going on in his life that we all deal with was something that really struck a chord with me in that particular storyline.
One of the cool things about the Chance of a Lifetime story is that oftentimes when reading, it's pretty frequent that you can find a story that's essentially a Superman story where somebody, they can't get it published through DC Comics, and so they just did a find and replace in the script, and then now it's this new character or something like that. And that is not the case with, in Chance of a Lifetime. That I feel like the way that Jim has written it, although you're correct that the archetype is Superman-esque, but it's a story, the origin of his powers and how he loses his powers, and it feels like an original, it is an original story that has an interesting twist for the character, and it's one that I really like. Around that same time I was doing, because the short story Chance of a Lifetime was initially 8 pages, and then shortly after that, Jim and I were shopping it around, and then eventually hooked up with a brand new publisher at the time that I'm not sure if they're still around or not, and it got expanded. We expanded the story into a 48-page one-shot, and at the time I was also working on other one-shots and other small projects and some backup stories for Image Comics on noble causes and stuff like that. And really, I always, anytime in any interview when people talk about my early work, whenever I talk about Chance, that's basically my favorite of all of that early stuff. It's something that I would still like to return back to, and we've talked about stuff like that for off and on for years. So it's a cool story, and it's one that because it was published from a small publisher, and not many people have really heard of it or anything, and I wasn't even involved. I'm glad that it was a digital comic, but I'm not even sure how that happened. Jim, like what was it that came about, or how did that get cooking that it became a digital download or whatever?
I think that was done through Chimera Comics. I really don't remember when it happened. I think after a while, after it stopped being, I guess there was only one print run of it, but I think after 3 or 4 years, I think I ended up getting the rights back to it. Mm-hmm. And then, the head of Chimera Comics asked, if we were interested in bringing it over there to digital. And honestly, a lot of the conversion was actually done on his side. I didn't really have too much involvement other than just kind of, seeing it at the end and giving my thumbs up to it. So I think it's still out there, honestly, but I haven't looked for a while.
It's its own app, which it's not like a part of like an iVerse app. There was actually 2 apps. There was an issue 1 app and an issue 2 app. So for people looking for it, that was the way I found it. And for me, and I don't know if there's an Android version, so if anybody listening, I'll try to research that and put it in the show notes as far as links to where to find it, so you can get it right from our show notes. For me, I got it on my iTouch at the time because it was an iPhone app. So you don't see it on the iPad side, it's actually on the iPhone side. So I'll put direct links in our show notes to it for anybody that's hasn't had a chance to read it, because I can't recommend it enough. It's a great story, and Freddie, you represented it very well. It doesn't feel like a cookie-cutter Superman story that was like, okay, this was pitched as a Superman story, so now we put in different characters, and you can tell that this is Superman, this is Lois Lane. That's why I think I used the term archetype, because it's that type of character, but he definitely is so much one of us. The humanity of him was really the rich part for me. You know, Jim, that leads me to a question for you. How long before, you reach out to Freddie, had this story been kind of percolating with you? How long have you been thinking about doing this story? Where did this come? What were some of the origins of it?
I don't even exactly remember the one idea that led me to the story, but I can just say at some point that I thought it'd be interesting, to have a story about someone who lost superpowers, and what would that do to them, and how would they feel about their life after they had a life that was unhuman, is so much larger than any human can experience. And then suddenly he's back to being, an everyday person. And that was definitely the origin of it. And like I said, it was kind of an 8-page short story. So it was more kind of like glimpses of his life rather than one solid story. And as far as like how long I had it for, I don't remember. I'm going to say probably like 6 months or so before I ended up contacting Freddie. I think at the time I had already written it out, a full script as an 8-page story. And then when I sent it to Freddie, it's just like a short pitch. Basically, an old man remembers his life when he had superpowers. That was kind of the origin of the 8-page story. And then when we got the opportunity to expand it, it really became, I guess, a chance for me to kind of do like a love letter to Marvel Comics, like the big fight comics. Yeah. When I was a kid, I loved the Hulk versus Thor comics, where they're basically fighting and destroying villages and towns and whatever's in their way. And so I thought it'd be kind of an interesting way to kind of take that emotional story and then kind of wrap it around a Marvel Comics-esque big fight scene. So
I loved in the story that he didn't lose all of a sudden, like the qualities. A lot of times when people get superpowers in comics, they all of a sudden become this different person than they were. What I found far more interesting about Chance of a Lifetime was the fact that you could see like his life path was still very much, especially when he first got his powers, maybe not so much so, but when he encountered the big bad of the story, like all of a sudden his faults, his weaknesses, the things we all have, come to the surface, and he's like, his instincts to run, and he, is like, I'm not going to win this. And he really had to, it was almost a reawakening during the battle, where he had to find the positives in a life that he was willing to chuck away at a certain point, which I found so rich. I was like, wow, this for him almost was, the fight was almost therapeutic in the way that he discovered himself. I can't imagine, not knowing that it was an 8-page beforehand, how cool that had to have been for you guys to kind of take that and say, okay, now we have a larger canvas to play with on this. Let's really develop this guy's world around him. And I mean, the love, like you mentioned, love letter, really comes across in the story. Not just for comics in general, but for the character world that you guys have created. I would love to see more in that world at some point. Just because even the part of the story where he was training other heroes, it'd be kind of cool to see how that played out. And maybe who some of the heroes were. Portions of his life that I think there's some interesting stories to explore.
I agree. If I had more time a few years ago, we're talking about making an expanded version, and off and on for a couple of years have discussed making a sequel book. And actually, I'm not sure if it's included in the iPhone app, but I know in the published version of Chance of a Lifetime, that was the one-shot version as opposed to the 2 parts on the iPhone app or whatever. There was an advertisement in the back for a sequel that we never actually, we had plotted out, and we still have the plots for it, but we never executed. just because that was about the time that I started getting real busy with, DC Comics work and whatever else. So honestly, it would be, of all the stuff that I've ever done, it would be what I would want to return to if given the chance, sincerely.
I want to talk about the Conan story, and I'm going to start by saying I hate you both. And let me explain why.
Let's just get off the phone now. Tell me your true colors.
I read this story, and Dark Horse's Conan, when they relaunched it and they got the rights and they started relaunching it, I started getting, I didn't jump on right away. I ended up grabbing one of the trades, and just because it looked interesting to me. And I got very into it. But as is the case with comics, I end up getting this backlog of trades that I just, time-wise, I don't get to. It's not because of quality or anything like that. So Conan was one of those where I was stockpiling it, and I stopped reading. Well, I started reading this story. The whole story made me go, oh, wait a minute, I really love Conan. So I started pulling out some of my trades that I've had stockpiling, and I'm like, oh, man, I'm going to start picking up more Conan now, which is, I think, and I'm joking when I say hate you guys, it's more of, it's a testament to a story when you kind of bring somebody into a world very quickly. And I love anthology titles just for this purpose. You have to, in a short number of pages, tell a complete story. But that story has to have a richness and a depth that really brings that in. The question that I have for you guys, kind of starting off with this, Conan stories, I know some of them come from Robert E. Howard's stories, some of them come from previous comic stories, some of them are original stories. What is the origin of this tale that you guys crafted here? Because I have a very casual Conan background. I love the character. I saw the movies. I've read broken Marvel issues. When I was a kid, I grabbed ones from flea markets and stuff. Always loved the character, but don't have like a rich history of runs with the character until Dark Horse started publishing it. So is this a story that was previously told? Is this an original story? Where did this come from?
I'll punt it to you, which is that, and that's actually a sports metaphor that I don't know anything about sports, so I hope that makes sense. But I will, on the basket or the football court, whatever it is. Anyway, at the end of, last year, at the end of 2013, I asked Jim if he wanted to. Okay, I knew that because Jim and I have been friends for such a long time, I knew that he was a big fan of Conan. I have a similar enjoyment of Conan in the same way that you do, Sean, that it's more like a casual acquaintance, with Conan. And one of my older cousins, back whenever I was a kid, was really into Conan, so I just always had this assumption that he was really cool. And then movies and some other stuff got me actually enjoying the character. And basically asked Jim if he would be interested in pitching with me a Conan story. Not that I had any idea what the Conan story would be, but I just wanted to try to get something published, a Conan story going over at Dark Horse. And then now that's to you, Jim.
This is an original Conan story. It doesn't, it's not an adaptation of Robert E. Howard at all. But it basically started. The original pitch was a little bit different. It just basically I threw some ideas towards Freddie. I said, hey, does anything sound good in particular? I think we ended up narrowing the list down to 2 different pitches, and we sent that over to Dark Horse. And it was kind of interesting because whenever you write a Conan story, there actually is a certain chronology that you have to follow. Like there is a young Conan, there is kind of a midlife Conan, and then there's an older King Conan. And so we definitely ended up having to kind of move our pitch and adjust, the age of the character a little bit. So in the story that we ended up doing, Conan is probably 17 to 18 years old.
And let me add a caveat to that, which is although all of that's accurate, I hope my editor didn't hear this, but although I knew that he was supposed to be thinner and they had established Conan whenever he was younger, although he was, athletic looking, he doesn't look as bulky as my picture of Conan in my mind, and I'm not really sure if I'll ever have a chance to draw Conan again. So I drew him not as big as I could have. I drew him on the smaller side of what I would want to draw of Conan. So of the paradigm of the scope of Conan, I drew him on the smaller side, just so to kind of, he wouldn't look like he was 40 or something. I probably should have drawn him smaller, but it was just out of artistic greed or something, whatever that is, to draw him a little bit bigger. But I'll add this in that the story that Jim and I kicked back and forth, we then pitched to Dark Horse. Then Dark Horse, the editor there, had said he liked the idea of what we had, but this is when we learned about the chronology that they had for Conan, where he said that, he liked what we had, but what about this couple of things? Like, he started pitching or, throwing ideas back at Jim. And so that's where eventually the story came from, was kind of just a mix of those sort of factors, because it's an 8-page story, and I think initially we even tried to pitch it as like a 10-page or something, whatever it was. So that's kind of like the mechanics of pitching or something. It's just kind of a give and take, and eventually everyone hopefully is happy, and then it has to stop by Robert E. Howard's estate to make sure that they approve things so it doesn't go outside of what they're trying to do with the branding of the character and all that sort of stuff. That, to me, I find that really interesting, because it's the unseen mechanics of any pop culture, media, but of comic books specifically. There's all these other factors. It's not just if you have a cool story. It's all these other kind of overlapping interests and stuff.
See, I like that, though, because a lot of times with licensed property, you get that impression, this is me as a reader, that sometimes when you have like comic book adaptations, they aren't necessarily a part of the overall chronology. And I'm a big fan of continuity. I like I like, if I read a story, I like it to be a part of it. It's not a deal breaker for me, because I want a good story. I mean, that's ultimately where I'm at. But what I love about this journey of this story is the fact that, wow, they really took a look at, okay, we've got these 3 eras of Conan. We want this story to be part of that chronology. And you've got to go through like this approval process, but then it becomes like in the minds of the estate, in the minds of Dark Horse, this story actually is a part of the chronology. I think that's really cool, because it's like you made your mark.
Yeah, it'll be included, and Jim had created the female love interest in the story, and it'll be interesting if a few months, I don't know how long it takes them to update things or whatever, but it would be really cool if her name ends up, appearing in the story of like a Wikipedia type thing of like different love interests he's had, or, you know what I mean? That would just be neat to actually have an impact on it or something.
One of the things I was wondering, when you create these shorter stories, do you actually think beyond this story and create how they met, how they what happened there, what did he do afterwards? Do you create that full picture, or do you focus on what the story is going to be?
Yeah, Jim, why don't you take that? Because you, although I sometimes, Jim is really cool about incorporating ideas that I have, but in this situation, because he's much more up on the continuity of Conan, and because he was given sort of the resources to look through the timeline and stuff, he took the storyline 100%. So do you want to answer that, Jim?
Yeah, personally, I was thinking it's like a month or two that Conan and Akima had been hanging out and, getting close to each other. And basically, hopefully I showed in the story that I wanted to show that the feelings were going both ways. Conan felt more about her than he might in some other stories, where he kind of randomly meets a bikini-clad woman. So, I just kind of wanted to show that the emotion went both ways. And so in my mind, that they were definitely hanging out for at least a month before the story takes place. And they definitely had plans to do something afterwards, but obviously, Akima had some, I guess it's a secret that she was hoping to be overcome, but it didn't quite work out, so.
Yeah, I definitely got the groove that there was something going on, and there was that solid emotional connection on both sides, and that was something that I was like, oh, that's kind of neat, because I was wondering if there would be a possibility of another story or something like that could show, when Conan met Akima or something like that.
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, I mean, I think it'd be very cool to do something like that. And I think probably the hardest part was, in order to establish that, I pretty much only had 3 or 4 panels to try to figure out, okay, how can I kind of show that, these people actually know each other and they didn't actually just meet 2 hours ago or something like that. So I'm glad that came across for you.
I think it also comes across in the sacrifice that she does, where she you get to know that in the beginning by their familiarity with each other. But when somebody does a sacrifice like she did, where she's obviously dealing with this entity inside her, fighting against that, No, I will not. Not even for you. And you see her, basically stab herself. Once somebody does something like that in that moment, you see Conan's reaction. Whatever he was feeling before has now kicked up to 11. Because you've seen this person now who you think would do this type of thing for you actually do it. How often in life does anybody get to see anything like that and really get that verified and validated that, like, wow, this person felt this strongly about me, that they would go to these lengths to protect me? That was a very powerful part of it. It also, I think, from what I do know of Conan's mythos, it explains a lot why it's hard for him to probably get into relationships, because he is surrounded by tragedy in his very violent world. Every time he gets with somebody where it gets close, there's usually some sort of twist that befalls the guy. I mean, it's not always a negative on the girl. It's a lot of times just life in his very savage world. Yeah. So it's really a powerful story on that end too.
Good, thank you. Yeah, and I guess when I got to the end of writing the story, I thought, it would definitely explain why Conan is so, he's not always one to just dive into a relationship like you were saying. There's something always kind of holding him back, and I thought maybe that the story can kind of play into that maybe he's thinking about what happened to her.
And I tell you, two of the panels that really got me thinking off page, got me thinking, how did these two meet, was right at the very beginning there, where Akima's initially trying to say, hey, why do we want to go down there? These past 2 days have been great. Why risk death? And you just see that little banter going on between them. The dialogue was cool, but also I do gotta give full credit over to Freddie on just the looks on their faces and just that tenderness, playful, loving type of looks that you're getting from Conan and from her. It was a really cool, okay, there's something here.
Thank you. Thanks. The only way that I contributed to the story was to try to just accentuate or enhance the stuff that Jim, or execute, I guess, the stuff that Jim had already written. So Jim had written, like on the first page, the sort of exchanges of glances between the two characters. And so that's, I'm trying my best to, sometimes in comics, subtlety is difficult to achieve, because if it's too subtle, it becomes non-existent. So you have to, oftentimes, I've heard this from comic book professionals, that drama in comics is melodrama. It's like you have to go, not on everything, but you generally have to go over the top. So, for example, if somebody is supposed to be bored, if you look at a real person when they're bored, some of the signs are subtle. It's like a lack of eye contact, or their body posture is slightly moved away from you as you're speaking, or that sort of thing. They don't usually cross their arms, sit way back, look up into the sky. It's like those are really exaggerated gestures. So in comics, you have to play somewhere in between those two. You have to be, your subtlety has to be pronounced subtlety, which is almost a contradiction. That's the kind of stuff that I was attempting to play off of, was just to make it obvious but not too over the top, especially with a character like Conan, who he's not overtly emotional. He's not, I guess, one for many public displays of affection. You know what I mean? It's just like a weird balance. Anyway, but all that stuff was actually, I think just about everything was just written into the script. So I just had to execute, or try to find the best way that I could to execute the intention of Jim in the story visually, though.
This story is a great example of one that you really need to read more than once, because it reads very differently the second time through, knowing where the events are going to go. In that first page, the part that we were discussing here, after Conan says, let's go, first of all, I love that sequence because it's that sense of adventure that Conan has. I mentioned earlier his dark world and everything that kind of crushes down around him, but there's always a sense of adventure that comes about with Conan. It's been true of the movies. It's been true of the comics that I've read. That's the part of it that I think makes Conan such an endearing character, is like, he still wants to get in the mix of all this. But her sense of regret when she puts her head down, because she's trying to keep him from going forward with this, you don't catch that the first time through because of the fact that you don't know her secret. When you read it the second time through, it's almost like a director's cut of the story, because now you, as the reader, know things that we didn't fully understand on the first page. And I love that. I'm a huge fan of seeing things through. Like, we're riding with Conan the first time through. We're riding with her the second time through because we know her journey more. That's the way I felt like the second time through, because I knew a lot more of her secret. So I was kind of seeing things from her perspective. And that sequence where she's behind him and her head's down meant different things to me the second time through, knowing where this was heading and knowing that she knew where this was heading.
That's a good way to describe it. You're riding with Conan, then you're riding with Akima. That's a good way to describe it.
Who did the color work?
I did. Well, my Kiki and I did. There was, let me see, the deadline on this story was a little wonky. It was like I wasn't real sure if I was going to be able to get it done in time for issue 9. There was even something about that on comic book resources that I was not listed, that mine and Jim's story was not credited in the previews, and that was just because because of my schedule and some other factors, it might not have been possible. It might have had to wait for issue 10 or something. Anyway, that was partially to expedite the story. Initially, I was not going to be doing colors, but it just so happens to overlap where one of the things I'm trying to pursue right now is expressing. I'm just trying to do new things. I don't often color my own work. So that was a way to do that, and also doing the full-on gray or ink wash for all 8 pages, and then I also did a sample render test page. So it was a total of 9 pages from my continuity in my mind, but only 8 pages show up in the book. And then adding colors to that as well was just another way for me to, it was another level of cool. It was like, first it was working with Jim and Conan and doing gray wash and doing colors. So it was just trying to have a good time on the story.
I'm a fan of fantasy stories, and I love books by Terry Brooks and things like that. And one of the things that I really loved about the color working, was why I was asking about it, is I'm a fan of when light sourcing is used in fantasy environments, because you've got these vast buildings that are majestic and ornate. You really want to get pulled into the whole environment, but there's also a certain tone and a setting, because it's not the world of today where we have, lots of buildings and pollution and different things like that. Our sky is different than what you would see in fantasy, because they don't have some of those things that we have today. So you get this, there's a beauty to it. No matter how dangerous or dark things get, there's a certain majesty to the things that you see around it, and it's an interesting balance. And I just thought the color work really showcased that along with the art. I mean, it really is, there's an emotion in the dialogue, the way the whole story is delivered, that I used the word adventure before, and that's something that I think in the best fantasy stories, there's this sense of wonder and adventure to the environment, to the events that are happening around you. Like, you're captivated by that. And that really stood out for me in this story.
Thank you. Yeah. And just a note about in the rendering stage, in the black and white version, there's added a lot of texture to the stone pillars and the stone floors and that sort of thing. And, to try to create what was hopefully felt like an immersive environment. And then outside, where they're out in front of like a marketplace and the big city and that sort of thing, it takes time, artistically, you have to invest a lot of time in building a world or something like that. Hopefully you only do a couple of really, really detailed backgrounds, and then hopefully from there the reader feels sucked in, and then from then on out, it's you don't have to draw quite as much. But every time there was a floor or every time there was a pillar or something, I had established this texture on the first couple of pages that I had inked. And after inking a couple of pages of that, I was like, oh my God, what have I done to myself? Because this texture is everywhere. Anyway, that just goes to like building an atmosphere or an environment or something. It was, once I had established it, I had to stick to it throughout, and that was tough. Whenever I was at the Arizona convention, I was inking. I took one commission, and that was basically all I could take, because all the rest of the time I was just inking at the table. I was inking on these pages just to get them done, because they're so labor intensive.
Question I have when I was looking at speaking of environments, Do they have rules on their cities? Because Conan has, a rich landscape. I mean, their own continents, their own cities, things like that. Are there certain rules when you start using like a capital city? Is there some guidance there or guidelines there, or how does that work?
Jim had, to be honest, I don't know. Jim, did you have any sort of direction in that way, or did you just write that it was, because the script that I have had, I don't even know how to say Korshemish? Korshemish is the name maybe of the city?
Yeah.
Did they tell you to use that or not to use it, or how it had to be?
No, I basically just, I went off the chronology that they sent me, and Conan, I ended up going like online, and, there's a bunch of Conan sites where you can find all the different cities and different kingdoms and things like that. So basically I just looked on the chronology about where he was about in that world. And, I wanted to kind of do it in a setting I think originally we ended up pitching that it was kind of like in the middle of a desert. And I honestly don't remember why we ended up having to change that.
The first couple of story ideas that we had really didn't overlap much with this one. So that was part of the reason, because originally it was like on the eve of a big battle where,
right,
Conan was going to talk to another general and all this other stuff. It was like totally different than what this is. So that might have been why.
Yeah, and so basically I just looked at the chronology and looked at, like the closest big city to about the area where the stories took place where he was, and I just picked that one. I thought it'd be an interesting city. Yeah, and that was basically kind of the start of that, really.
I like that he's a character where you can find out, like, based on timeline, whereabouts he was. I mean, it's an interesting part of the story that I didn't realize. I guess this is me being more of the casual Conan fan, and that actually makes me more intrigued about the character, knowing that the chronology is so well developed. But I like that it's well developed and you can like place where the character is, but there's also a large enough tapestry that a creator can come in with a story like this and kind of go, okay, he was here at this time. We have this story idea that we'd love to do with him, and let's fold it into this setting because this would be something that would happen on his travels. I think it's easier almost in his world because of the fact that travel is slower. The fact that we're not using today's vehicles and today's technology. Getting from place to place is going to be a much more tedious process, a longer process. When you land somewhere, when you stop off at a place, you're more likely to stay there for long periods of time or visit surrounding cities. And I think it leaves open opportunities for creators to get clever and say, wow, this is where Conan's head was at this time of his life. Let me see if I can do this cool story where I think the relationship for me was something right away. I'm like, I know enough about Conan's history to know, wow, this really plays heavily into who he is as a person and his interpersonal relationships, especially in the story with Valeria. So I love how this story played out because I really felt like it was, ooh, wow, this says a lot about who he is and why he is that way and his resolve.
That's great. It was definitely fun, just during the pitch process of actually going through the chronology and trying to figure out some time periods where one story idea might work. And I think that's kind of like one of the processes we went through was once we found out about, the official chronology that they use, I just kind of went through there and said, okay, well, there's 2-year period between, this Robert E. Howard story and the other one. So how about we have an adventure here? And basically that's what I did, pretty early on in the process and just sent it over to Freddie.
Is that Durketo a part of Conan history? Am I pronouncing the name right?
Yeah, I think you are. That was actually suggested by the editor that we use her. Originally, I was just going to use Set as the evil god, the typical one in most of the Conan stories, and he actually made that suggestion. So I don't know if Durketo's been in any of the original Robert E. Howard stories or not, but I was able to go up on the web and I found a lot of information about her. So
now that you're talking about this, I'm reminded that when we first got the initial input back from the editor, I had suggested that we have Conan, or it somehow came about, I don't know how much, because whenever Jim and I work together, it's really, really collaborative, so I don't remember who said what, but whatever the case was, the story initially that I remember us working together on was that Conan was angry about he was supposed to wind up in an old temple that was in worship of Crom, and he was either questioning Crom's existence. Jim, do you know what I'm talking about? Am I messing this up, or does it sound?
Yeah, I think you're crossing the two different pitches that we had. Yeah, we definitely had a second pitch that involved Crom, or at least Conan's idea of Crom. Whether it was actually Crom or not, kind of was an open thing. But yeah, I think originally on the original pitch, like I said, it was a story that took place actually later on when Conan was a king, and basically he was going to marry this one princess from another kingdom, and that was kind of like the story's setting. I think kind of the actual plot of the events were basically similar to how you see here in the Conan story. Just a lot of things kind of adjusted around it and kind of made adjustments to the story in order to fit that any of the changes.
I loved the like trickster nature of the entity, in the sense that Conan shoves the sword through, but in the end he was trying not to kill her, and he winds up doing it, because that was really the only way that the story that was the tragedy of the story. The only way that was really going to end was going to be by that, no matter what Conan tried to do. I'm a fan of stories like that, where you're rallying for the hero to find a way to save her, but the ultimate tragedy is, no matter how powerful Conan is, sometimes when you're dealing in the worlds of sorcery and magic, there are things that are out of your control. And it's a story where it was about Conan surviving. It wasn't necessarily about Conan winning, because the victory would have been him walking off with her. In this case, he survived this battle. He didn't win this battle. I like those stories because there's something intriguing about that. It's something that's a little bit different. He still feels like the hero. He still feels like this heroic adventurer, but it's not always clean. That is a far more rich and interesting world, because that adds a reality to it for me when you're dealing with something fantasy related, because real life is like that. It doesn't always go the way we want it to. Sometimes you just have to learn how to survive through events. It's not always this kind of hoorah victory. That was the part that I really liked about the story, was that kind of twist. And I think it's a fun thing about Conan's world, that sometimes you get that major victory, other times you don't, and you've got to be impressed that Conan still manages to go on.
I think that in the story I wanted to show, just how intelligent Conan is. But I think that, having this story take place early, when he's still a young man, he still hasn't encountered a ton of supernatural or demons or gods in this story. So at this point, he doesn't have a lot of experience. So he actually thinks that he might be able to outsmart Derketo. And so he proceeds by trying to trick her out of Akima's body, thinking that, hey, okay, I can save Akima this way. But as he quickly learns, facing a god or a demon is not like facing any kind of human. God has powers beyond anything that he knows, and it doesn't work out in his favor.
Yeah, that was something that I thought was kind of neat, showing the strategery of Conan, where he tried to trick the demon / god, however you want to refer to her, but does kind of backfire. But I did like that part of it.
If there's a knocking at your door, it's Conan. He wants to talk to you about strategery.
I use that word, by the way. I think there's nothing wrong with that word. As long as you say it with a little bit of a smile on your face, then everyone should be in on the joke. That's just to say strategery. I mean, that's I don't know if it actually appears in the dictionary, but I think everyone should understand. It's like instead of saying philosophy, I'll say philosophy, because it's a good word. It's got a lot of syllables.
You're enabling him. You are enabling him.
Let me just say, Jim, thank you, because I didn't know how I was going to work it into here. And I'm like, oh, crud, we're getting near the end of this. I got to figure this out, because I have to bring it up every single time we do a show. So thank you very much.
No, you don't. That heart-wrenching sequence at the end, I love that, because if you read it again the second time, and you get that sense of the relationship from the other side of it, that sequence at the end where he's carrying her off is like, it's immensely powerful the first time, but it reads very differently at the end. You're like, oh my gosh. And I like those sequences where the hero chooses to care. Like, if he didn't care about her, he could have just left her there. and kind of just left off, and there's Conan the Survivor, gets on a horse or something and just kind of goes and does his thing, very Western cowboy kind of thing. In this case, though, there's a relationship here. It's an important relationship. She can't just be left there. He can't pay somebody else to clean this up. He cares about her. This is his responsibility. He needs to do something about this. And I'm a big fan of the close-up on his face where you see this kind of remorse to what had happened going off into the sunset. It's I guess the Western reference is very good in that one too, because I love the old spaghetti Westerns where you have that kind of sense of at the end, the hero kind of going off and there's been some form of tragedy too. There was something endearing about that whole sequence, and I'm glad it wasn't a one panel sequence, because I think it would have lost what I'm mentioning here if you didn't see the gradual of him lifting her up from the inside of there, walking to the outside, and then this sense of vastness to the travel to take her wherever they were ultimately going to wind up for, the ritual at the end for her. I was a big fan of the Schwarzenegger film when they ended up burning Valeria's body, or they put her on that pyre. And, those sequences for me, there's something to that way that stands out. I don't know. I love the way this all, that was a very rich sequence for me.
Yeah, for sure, Freddie definitely made that last page sing. I mean, it's, he carried all the emotional weight in there. As you can see, there's no words or anything, not much for a writer to do other than kind of hopefully describe what's going on, and he definitely added a lot to what I wrote.
I was going to say, one of the things I found out throughout this whole story, I did keep hearing the music from the Conan movies, because that's mostly my exposure to Conan is the movie. So there's just that dun 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 dun. Those type of powerful sequences and the fighting, and then even at the end there where he's carrying the body, this felt very real to what I thought Conan and who Conan is.
Yeah, and I have to say that the original Conan soundtrack still remains one of my all-time favorite soundtracks.
Oh, yeah. Was it Basil Polidorus? Or I'm probably butchering the name. I have actually some of it on my iPod right now. I love listening to... That's one of those soundtracks that I will play again, because the instrumentals are so rich in that one.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely have a Pandora playlist with Conan and Gladiator, all the good stuff on there. I
just have to just because the movie Gladiator hardly ever comes up, that I want to recall this, where when my wife and I went and saw that, we had one of our friends with us named Jeremy, and so we went and saw Gladiator, and towards the end of the movie, spoiler alert, although everyone should know that this is a spoiler podcast, but is that at the end of the movie, Joaquin Phoenix's character, he wants to engage in a public arena in the auditorium or whatever it is, the arena. He wants to engage in battle against Russell Crowe's character, and he wants everyone to see, Joaquin Phoenix wants everyone to see him defeat Russell Crowe. And then right before they go out into the battlefield, Joaquin Phoenix punctures Gladiator's lung, so that he'll be at an incredible disadvantage, even though we've seen earlier in the story Joaquin Phoenix actually knows how to fight. He's in a training sort of way. There's a scene where he's fighting against several different, royal trainers or something like that. In any case, the point of this story is that there's a big long battle. Initially or eventually, Russell Crowe's Gladiator succeeds, and they're in this almost like an embrace where he's shoving Russell Crowe's shoving this blade into Joaquin Phoenix's neck or face or whatever it is. The music has dropped out, and when he's shoving the blade in, he's also kind of slowly moving him towards the ground or something. And there's this guy, so this is the punchline, or this is the climax of the story. There's this guy in the theater with us. It's me, Kiki, Jeremy, and then 3 rows down, there's this couple, and the guy of this couple is the focus of this part of the story. I don't think there's anyone else in the theater. There might be a couple of other people. And he goes, and it's in this really silent part of the movie, and then this guy goes, "Yeah, lay him down like a little baby, lay him down."
Wow.
That's awesome.
It was and it's impossible for me to watch that movie. Kiki and I still say that. If even when we're like, if we're playing with our cats and the cat's kind of getting frisky, we'll take the cat and we'll lay it down and we'll say, lay down like a little baby. It was just like this. But at the time, it really pissed us off because it completely ruined the climax of the film, the action-y climax. I mean, there's like an emotional climax after that where, there's the slave friend who buries the figurine or whatever it is. But anyway, it always stands out in my mind. And when else will I have a chance to tell that story on a podcast? Probably never.
The question I have about that is the thought process of the guy that's yelling that out. How do you watch that movie and arrive at that conclusion? Lay him down.
I think he was so pissed at he was so mad at Joaquin Phoenix's character because he does. Joaquin Phoenix does a good job of being a real jerk in that movie.
Oh yeah.
And actually, there's parts where he's sympathetic too. I think Joaquin Phoenix is a good actor, and he did a good job in the movie. It made this guy in the theater so happy for his death that when Russell Crowe finally is killing him, that was his version of rubbing it in Joaquin Phoenix's face. I guess he was cheering. That was like his "I'm happy that you're dying" as a character. Is that he said, "Yeah, that's right. Lay him down like a little baby." I don't know. I don't know where he got that from either. I don't know if that's something him and his friends say or something. I have no idea because we don't know that guy. So,
and his career as a babysitter ended shortly after that. So.
Yeah, we have heard how you lay babies down, and it's very odd. It's very odd.
The Conan story, one other question I have, and I was thinking about this when you guys were talking about Chance of a Lifetime and how you originally did a shorter version of that story. Is it harder to put together, because this is a real tight 8-page story. There's a lot of depth to it. There's a great beginning, middle, and ending. It's not a lot of space for you guys it's not a lot of canvas for you guys through dialogue and through art, to develop that kind of narrative and that kind of story. Is it hard to do that? I mean, what was that collaboration like, or is that easier? As a reader, I'm assuming that that's harder than when you have a full issue to do. But am I wrong on that, or what is that like for you guys?
Yeah, I think as far as plotting, I don't think it's any harder. I think the hardest part is when you actually get to the writing and, you kind of realize real quick how much you have to accomplish on each page. And then there's always a part where, especially in this story, we actually start writing it and you kind of realize, I have 9 panels on this page. I'm like, I kind of feel bad for Freddie, but I don't know what else to do. 9 panels, and hopefully, we can kind of figure something out. But I think that's probably, just like you said, it's just the limited space where you kind of really have to figure out ways to condense things, and I guess hopefully get across the feeling, kind of like in this story in the beginning, where you actually hopefully get the feeling that these people know each other and they feel strongly for each other. But then you have to kind of move on to the next thing, where we learn quickly that Akima has a secret, and obviously Conan doesn't know what that secret is. And yeah, I think that's just the hardest part, is like when you actually kind of finalize that plot into a script.
Because Jim and we've had a long-standing friendship and stuff. Like he had shown the first draft of the script to me, and then we kick back and forth ideas. And on a side note, I also send him like my roughs and that sort of thing before I send it on to the editor to get. Ultimately, I want this to be in service to Jim's script, and so we give each other feedback off and on and stuff. But whenever he sent me the initial pass of the script, there was there was some concern on my part that there's not going to be enough room for me to open up the visuals, which is to say, you don't have to have every page be a splash page or something, but I didn't want the visuals to feel crowded on every page. And there's a benefit. Some pages, it helps the storytelling if there's a lot of small panels. It can set a pacing or a mood or something. But if you have it on every page, it ends up making the story, in my opinion, feel claustrophobic, depending on how much action or how much dialogue. So if there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of panels and a lot of actions in those panels, it can start to feel, the reader will feel claustrophobic or something. So after I got the finalized script from Jim on my first pass of roughs, I just look to see where, it's the same thing I do with any script, which is I look to see where I can condense actions. So if there were 2 panels that I felt like I could combine those 2 actions from those 2 panels into a larger panel, then I did that. And I think I maybe did that on 3 pages perhaps. And then there was a page I added a panel because I felt like it needed a bigger beat of when the characters enter the room. And then the last page, I made it a montage image, but it was almost still the same sort of stuff that Jim had outlined in the script as far as the same beats, but I just made it one larger overlapping panel. So it was a more design thing rather than a condensing thing, to try to accommodate hopefully a bigger visual, but it still communicates the same things happening.
I'm a big fan of anthologies because I think a lot of times you get the opportunity to see just a lot of creative juices going on there, where because of the fact I think you're limited with space and you've got to really tell like a tight story in that time frame and a creative story. You'll get a unique kind of storytelling that you don't get elsewhere. I'm a fan of all different kinds of comic book development, but anthologies seem to, for like a long stretch, be like this kind of taboo thing where like nobody was doing anthologies because they didn't sell. And I'm the kind of reader that I really quite like them because I like the variety of story that you get in them. There's an opportunity to tell things that you can't get away with in a regular book, and sometimes using a main character as the draw to the anthology, you can start telling stories about side characters or little tales that wouldn't normally make it in the main book, and I quite like that. But when you were talking about the artwork, one of the things that really stood out for me was the choices that you made as far as like establishing characters in a larger sequence, like that sequence where Conan says, "Let's go" on the first page, and you kind of get like a really nice shot of the determination of Conan. But then you get a shot of, right on the next page afterwards, the larger panel is the establishment of this place that they're going into, and the majesty of that. I loved the shot where it's "Where are the stars?" and you got to see like the wide shot of the 2 of them. You know, it's again that light sourcing that I was talking about. But then you also do it with the demon, because we need to see this creature as the reader. I want to know, like, size-wise, the comparisons to Conan, because Conan's a big guy, and Conan should look big and powerful. I should never be able to be anything like Conan, because he's Conan. I mean, that's my impression of Conan, is throughout whatever age Conan is, he, like, genetics and the environment that he's raised in, and the fact that, you know, there's a constant manual labor to everything that he does. He's walking everywhere, he's fighting everywhere. This should be a strong, muscular guy. He carries himself in a way that you should never see a Conan walking down your street. But that's part of what the joy is of reading Conan. Then when you see him fighting somebody like Derketo, and it's so clearly larger than Conan, double his size, and yet he's still not backing down because he's Conan. There's something to, like, I don't know, if a demon's possessed my girlfriend, I'm not going to say, "Hey, come on out, let's fight." I don't know that that's going to be the first thing on my hit list. I mean, I'd like to think I would defend her. My wife, I would defend her. I would do something, to be there for her. But I'm going to certainly use my wits because I am not Conan. I'm going to try to defend her in a different way. This sequence, though, where Conan, there is no backing off of the idea, let me get her out of there and let me combat it, because if there's a separation of her from the girl, there's a chance for me to save her. And that's just a very Conan way of handling it. There is a strategy to it. There's a smarts to what he's doing. That it's in a way that Conan knows his skill set will allow him to do. The confidence that I can take down this demon is something that I always like about the character. And it has to do with his size, his demeanor. His brains are often something that you forget about with the character, and I like that aspect to him as well.
Yeah, me too. I was definitely hoping to show a little bit of that in the story, too, that, he's definitely a person who thinks. Earlier we were talking about Gladiator, and, honestly, I think Conan, I think in the original stories of Robert E. Howard, he's so much more like Maximus. He's so much more like a general. Usually later on in his life, but even as a young man, he's a very intelligent person. I think in the books he speaks like 6 or 7 different languages. He can decode. He can read all these ancient symbols. He's a super intelligent guy. And while in our story, we're talking about a younger version of him, it's kind of hoping to show that even a little bit just how intelligent he is. He's not just a big guy with a sword who starts swinging anything in his way, but he's actually given it some thought. He wants to try to figure it out, and obviously he's going to use a sword to in this case, but he's definitely using his mind too.
Well, he said, unless you're afraid of a man, he was doing a psychological warfare there to get the scenario set up in the way that he wanted it, which, he didn't have time to discuss this with a committee. I mean, he really had to this is on the fly. I'm going to have to play off of the ego that I'm clearly figuring out from the conversation with this beast, that if I don't somehow play into that and set up a scenario that I think I can win, that was the part that I really liked about it.
Great. Yeah, it was definitely fun to write it, and it was fantastic to see Freddie's final pages come in.
There's only so many. Conan was really caught off guard, and no, what other resource does he have? He has a sword and he has wits, and that's all he can really apply to the situation. So the only real, he's taking a gamble to see what he can try to leverage psychologically out of the situation, and he does his best and stuff. And that was one of the things, there's a tendency now, and I think everyone wants to do this type of thing occasionally, but not every story has to be epic. Not every story has to have the world at stake. It can be a psychologically interesting story that you deal with. You're dealing literally with the loss of a single life, and Conan himself is kind of in he's in peril or in danger as well. But it's not like the demon is saying, if you don't do this thing, then I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to leave this temple and start eradicating the earth or something like that. It's not everything has to be on that sort of level of scope or scale for it to be really important to the characters involved. So, and of course this is an 8-page story, but I'm saying we could have had that in the dialogue to try to make it, in quotes, feel like it was something bigger. But I like it that it stays more, he's fighting for Akima. That's what he's fighting for. That's what's important to him at that moment, because he actually loves her, and it's not about this, I don't know. I think that there's a certain fatigue involved with having the stakes always being so much larger in every movie and every TV show. It's always about world domination or world destruction or something like that. And that's cool too. That's cool, but it doesn't always have to be about that.
You don't get to know the character if you don't explore some of the other themes, because I think that's one of the things that I liked about this. I felt like I got to know Akima in a very short time. I got to know the demon, and I got to know Conan. It's always great when you got a character like Conan that you felt like you got to know something a little bit more about him. It feeds into no matter where you're at as far as your history with Conan and your awareness of the character, there was something to garner here about who he is and what he's all about and what has affected him. And I like that. If you don't explore those themes, those big events don't mean anything, because you don't really know the character. You're not really invested.
Yeah, it's not as intimate.
And I'm personally looking forward to round 2 between these two. If a story gets me thinking off page, and this one definitely had me thinking, the before stuff happened, but the after stuff happened. Does Conan run into this demon again? Does he learn from past mistakes? How's he handle it?
Yeah, I would definitely love the opportunity to show that again. It was definitely a fun time. Any chance to work with Freddie is always great, but it's even better when we get to work on someone so iconic like Conan.
Guys, is there anything else we want to say about the Conan story that we left out?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, I was hoping to pull the reader in and kind of hopefully have them, experience a more kind of emotional side of Conan. Portray that was kind of my goal for the story, where, he's going to be just a badass with a sword, but I was kind of hoping that the reader could experience some emotion with him, and that was kind of my goal.
Jim, anything that you'd like to shout out?
Yeah. I actually have a DeviantArt page on there. If you go to the gallery section, there's actually 2 short stories that Freddie and I worked on, and there's a couple other things on there too. But yeah, I don't know if a lot of people have seen those 2 short stories we did.
Yeah, what are the 2 short stories? Like, could you just tell me the titles?
Yeah, one is The Last Sun, the samurai story that was never published that we did, and then I have the Angel's Bane one on there.
Oh, cool.
And I'll have links to that in the show notes. So for anybody listening, just go directly to our show notes. You can click on them, and you're right there.
Awesome.
Freddie, anything you want to shout out, buddy?
layhimdownlikealittle.baby.com.
Is that going to be your new website?
I'm going to go and register it, and then just have it forward to my website. Anyway, no. Let's see. I mean, my website, freddieart.com, is the primary one. I have links to my Facebook and Twitter and DeviantArt and my YouTube page as well. Just go to freddieart.com, and then there's a whole bunch of links off to the side that you can look at. I usually keep a pretty up-to-date column on my homepage of the current projects that I'm working on, because one of the great luxuries of not being in an exclusive with DC, although the exclusive is awesome, there's, I've been getting the opportunity to work on a lot of different side projects, like shorter stories, and like this Conan story, and several other projects that haven't been announced, but also there's several things that are on there. So that's about it for me, though.
And cover work. A lot of really cool cover work.
Thank you. Yeah, that came about with whenever I was working on the Brain Boy miniseries for Dark Horse, that I guess Dark Horse was wanting, or maybe still is, the theme of their covers was that they wanted all the covers to be painted or feel like they were painted. So digital painting or something that kind of looked like oil paints. And I cannot do that. I do not know how to do that. But I still wanted to do covers for Brain Boy. And so I had suggested that Dan Scott, a good friend of mine who used to work at Hallmark, and we've been friends for, I don't know, not quite as long as Jim and I, but for a long time, I suggested maybe he could do digital paints, and he was wanting to do some more comic book cover work. He usually works on Magic the Gathering and Warhammer artwork. Anyway, so it was a chance for us to work together and collaborate, and so that began me doing. I did 4 covers for Brain Boy, but then they also had me do a bunch of covers for Captain Midnight, 4 covers for Skyman, 4 covers for the book that's called X, like issues 17 through 20 of that. I don't know, some other ones too. It's really fun to get to do that, because it's like, if you take on an entire project where you're working on it for months at a time, that's like a huge investment of your life. But if you get to do covers or like a pin-up here and there or something, then it's like a fun walk-on roll for that project, and then you can keep walking, get to work on several different small things.
I like how they're doing a reemergence of their superhero line, because that had fallen to the wayside for a while, and then they seem to be bringing back and creating new, unique characters that are falling in the superhero world of theirs. And it's cool to see that making a comeback. Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's cool stuff. Also, they're doing their Dark Horse is doing a lot more creator-owned stuff. So you get stories by Mike Oeming, who I think is incredible artist and a strong writer as well. Image Comics does an awful lot of creator-owned stuff. That's almost all they do. But Dark Horse also has a really strong foothold in that arena as well. So if no one was aware of that, I would recommend looking into it.
Guys, is there anything else we want to shout out before we wrap up the segment?
I just wanted to say thanks to Freddie for inviting me to do the pitch again. It was definitely a lot of fun. And if I can just thank Dark Horse and Patrick Thorpe over there at Dark Horse for working with us. And then definitely I want to say thanks to you guys. I'm definitely a big fan of the show, and I've been listening to you guys for a long time. So it's really cool to have an opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you for coming on. This was a thrill for us. It was great to be able to talk to the whole creative team about such a rich story like this. It's just to see the insights on all sides of it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Jim, that was very well said. So I will copy and paste the same thing. And thank you, Jim, too. It's been, in addition to all the side projects that we've talked about in Chance of a Lifetime and the Conan story and stuff like that, Jim has always made himself available to any time that I have written, the few things that I've written in the past, short stories and that sort of thing, and co-written and whatever, and even my how-to book, The DC Comics Guide to Digitally Drawing Comics. Jim Mitchell has always been my target reader, I think is how I even credited him in that how-to book, basically, that he's always made himself available to look through that stuff and give me his honest opinion and feedback and suggestions and that sort of thing. So that's always been super generous of you, Jim, and I appreciate it.
You're welcome. You know what I always say, lay it down like a little divot.
I have a funny... This is going to become like a catchphrase that's used at really wrong times. Although it was already started that way. So.
It was, yeah. And just think about when Gladiator was in theaters. That was like, wasn't that 1999 or was that 2000?
Yeah, I want to say like the late 90s at least.
2000 is what it's... Let's Wikipedia.
Oh, okay.
IMDb says 2000.
Okay. So let's say that was 14 years ago. But the reason I'm saying that is because Kiki and I still say that at least once a week. And so it already is a catchphrase for us, for sure, because that's something we say just whenever it seems like it'll be a funny thing to say,
Do you ever feel you use it at an appropriate time?
At an appropriate time?
Because it doesn't seem like one of those things, like, because of its origins, like, you can really say, like, at, like, the right time. It's got to be something you say where, like, this just wrong.
I don't know what the appropriate time would be to say, to say that, lay him down like a little baby, I don't know. I don't know when that's appropriate. So I guess, yes, every time we say it, it's appropriate, actually. So.
All right, guys. Well, thank you both again for joining us for this segment. We really appreciate it.
Holy caffeine!
I want to remind everyone about our show voicemail line. It's 1-440-388-4434 or drnorge on Skype. We love having you a part of the show. And also want to remind everyone about our website, ragingbullets.com. We actually do all of our show updates right from the website. It goes to our Twitter and our regular Facebook page. We have a wonderful Facebook group. It's the Raging Bullets DC Infinite Facebook group. And it's actually, if you aren't familiar with Facebook groups are separate than Facebook pages. It's a chat group, and it's like a message board. That's the best way to think of it. It's a message board, and it's a wonderful community of people who just really enjoy comics and pop culture in general. So please consider joining the group. I'm a big fan of it, and I want to thank everyone who participates there, because that to me is the key. It's just such a wonderful community of people who participate there. We are available also on Google+. So whatever your social media preference, you can get information about the show from all of them. So I want to thank everyone for shouting us out and liking the podcast and sharing updates on what we're doing. We get a lot of retweets every week, and I really appreciate that. We don't have like a advertising budget, so the only way people find out about us, new people, is from you. So I appreciate anybody who shouts us out anywhere that you're able to shout out podcasts. It means a lot to us, and I would encourage you to do that with not just us, but any podcast you listen to. It's great to let people know what you're enjoying out there. Sponsoring this episode is DCBService.com and InStockTrades.com. As we mentioned at the beginning of the show, DCB Service is more than just single comic issues. You can get hardcovers, trades, bundles of variants, toys, statues. I'm getting those Batman black and white statues, selected ones from favorite artists, and I'm loving them. I think they're just fantastic. But it's nice to be able to, as you were mentioning with the variants at the beginning, Jim, it's nice to be able to know that you're going to get that and you get it at a discount, because the upsell, if you're trying to get them like off of eBay or something like that, winds up being pretty pricey from time to time, especially if it's a hard to find issue or a hard to find statue or action figure or whatever. It's nice to be able to pre-order them at a discount. That's half the key there. You're getting them at a discount when you pre-order them and in with your comics, so your shipping doesn't cost anything more to do that. So I want to thank DCBService.com for being our pre-order source. Over at InStockTrades.com, I loved this story, as you heard on this episode, and Jim, I know you did too. Robert E. Howard's Savage Sword #9. You can pick it up now, $7.99 regularly, 42% off, only $4.63. If you weren't sold on it at the beginning, I'm sure as we were talking about the story, it hooked you in and you want to read this. This is an 80-page volume that has a collection. It's an anthology, and I'm a fan of this book. I wasn't kidding. I'm actually reading a lot of Conan now because of it. I'm getting caught up on trades that I've had. Conan's been one of those things I've stockpiled because I've always liked the character concept. I've gotten very into it since Dark Horse publishes it. It's contemporary while at the same time feeling classic. And what I mean with that is it's modern storytelling versions of Conan, but it's Robert E. Howard's classic stories. And it's cool to see original material mixed in, but that they have it set into that continuity. That Conan's got a timeline. He's got a life, where he did these travels, and then he became king, and these stories fit into those different chronologies. And I'm a big fan of that kind of stuff. So I want to thank DCBService.com and InStockTrades.com for supporting our show. Our next episode, Jim, a lot of new comics have come out since we've last had a chance to talk DC Comics. Gotham Academy, a new issue of Batgirl. We got Clarion. We have Trinity of Sin that came out. Did you get a chance to read that yet?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that. Plus, we also want to talk about that Green Lantern Godhead storyline that's out. So we will see you next week.
Bye!
On November 13th, Sean Whalen was asked to stop constantly talking about comic books. That request came from his wife. Deep down, he knew she was right, but he also knew that someday he would find someone that would talk to him. With nowhere else to go, he appeared at the home of his childhood friend Jim Segulin. Sometime earlier, Segulin's boss had requested that he shut up about his comic books and never speak of them again. Can two grown men put out a DC Comics podcast without driving each other crazy? It's Raging Bullets, the DC Comics fan podcast. With Sean Whalen as Dr. Norge, and Jim Segulin as the Sensei of the Whatnot and the Duke of You-Know. It's a spoiler podcast, so they will go in depth into the plotline, story twists, and whatnot of the comics they are reviewing. So if you haven't read the books, you may want to come back later so you may better enjoy the show.